Okay, people are showing up. We always give a minute or two, let folks get in here before we dive into the topic. But I'm sure I don't know, Marcus or Will, can y'all see the participant number down there? That's how many people we got coming in to
Cool.
hang out.
Nice.
Yeah, I can see it stacking up fast.
Let's do this. Let's while we're killing time before we get into like anything of sustenance in the discussion. Uh for those that are curious or may find this information valuable, the masterclass tonight was almost just me and Dr. Marcus Lashley because I'm going to tell the story. you, or I'll let you tell the story. You want to tell us what happened?
Yeah, we were. I'll give you all the short version. We were burning today, so very appropriate. And I got a Polaris Ranger stuck, and everything was. I thought we were going to be able to get it out in time, and then I kept looking at the watch, and it was going to, ticking closer and closer and closer. And finally, I was just like, I gave up, and I took off. I knew that somewhere else on the property there was a guy on a dozer putting in some fire lines because he had touched up ours before we started this morning. So I went and ran him down, and luckily he wasn't that far away and was able to get him over there and got us pulled out in the nick of time. So I got home. I literally got home, slung the trailer in the driveway sideways, hopped off, ran in, got a 5-minute shower, choked down some pasta, and here I am.
There it is. I love
Getting
it.
it done.
Yeah, hilarious. So let's before we kick off here, just some administrative stuff or housekeeping type stuff. Just so I know, this meeting is being recorded. So those of y'all that are watching, if either of these guys say something or give a piece of information, you're like, "Oh, that's good. I need to write that down." All this stuff's recorded, be archived, and can be found on the onX website. We'll put it up there. Also, your cameras aren't on, your microphones aren't on, you won't be able to be seen or heard. You can go to the Q&A box, or you can go to the box in the chat. We have some pre-submitted questions that we'll try to touch on. If you have live questions as you're sitting there, you can put it into the Q&A box down there. And other than that, let's get to talking about fire. Gentlemen, do you want me to start? Do y'all want to start, or I can go right to these pre-sent in questions? I can go either way.
Marcus, you want
Well,
to do a quick little spiel on turkey selection of areas, and we can use that to kind of just set up this whole discussion about why we're burning for turkeys.
yeah, I think that's a good idea. So obviously, I'm sure a lot of folks in this meeting are really familiar with wild turkey biology, but you may not realize how much of that biology has been connected to fire for a long time. And there's some really, really interesting history if you go all the way back, to some of the early explorers, even where they were describing a landscape, especially in the eastern United States over to the fall line, uh, in the central part of the United States. They were describing it essentially as a savanna landscape. And what that means is it's basically a sparsely uh, treed area with a developed understory that's dominated by herbaceous plants. And most people, when I say herbaceous, think of grass, but the reality is the majority of species are probably broadleaf, so think flowering herbaceous plants. And
Mm-hmm.
there certainly were grasses mixed in with those as well, and they may have even dominated the biomass in some cases. But in terms of species diversity, a lot of it was dominated by forbs. Well, the way that a landscape persists in that kind of condition over long term is from relatively frequent fire occurring.
Mm-hmm.
So, if we take that for what it's worth, that was the kind of landscape, that we know that wild turkeys flourished in. Those same explorers were also lamenting about not being able to sleep in the morning. They were describing a landscape where there were almost as many turkeys as there were trees. There were explorers talking about riding in a wagon for weeks and never being out of the sight of turkeys. So from what we know, they were really abundant on the landscape when it was functioning that way. If
Mm-hmm.
you take a look at that same landscape now, particularly where I work and I'm really familiar in the eastern US, almost none of the landscape would I classify as savanna now. So I think that's kind of giving you a historical perspective for why fire might be such an integral part of how we manage landscapes for wild turkeys and a variety of other wildlife species as well. Many of the ones that are of conservation concern would be linked to the same kinds of conditions and vegetation that we would be trying to promote with prescribed fire.
Yeah.
So uh, just in general, for wild turkeys, the several aspects of their biology are promoted by conditions that we see when we have a relatively open canopy forest or grasslands that have frequent fire. And in particular, what we see is a nesting success and a poult rearing success that are far greater when fire is being implemented and light is not limited in the system.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So don't think about a closed canopy forest system, but if we have an open canopy where light is no longer limiting plant responses, that frequent fire is creating a ground cover condition that's dominated by those herbaceous species that turkeys really flourish in. And they might use it for various things, like right after fire, where they may be using it to strut and forage in as adults. Only a couple of months after fire, especially in places with long growing season and you know, that aren't water limited, we see the vegetation response uh, happen really quickly so that plants colonize and create really high quality brooding cover. And then only a year or two after fire, depending on where you're at, you start to develop more structure up to a couple, you know, think about vegetation from your belt high up to your shoulder high. It's starting to have some woody species get mixed in. You know, that starts to develop into really high quality nesting cover. And when you
Mm-hmm.
start to put those things together in an arrangement on the landscape where hens can select high quality nesting cover and it's in close proximity to high quality brooding cover, and those plant communities are dominated by those herbaceous species that produce enormous amounts of insects and seeds, we start to see a turkey population that's extraordinarily productive in that situation.
Yeah. That was really good. And Marcus, just to throw out some quick stats to build off of what you said, you know, you mentioned that nesting success can be higher in areas that are burned because of the plant community, right? And that's what I want to make sure we keep everybody's mind on here tonight is that, you know, fire is just a tool to achieve a desired plant community that is beneficial to turkeys, right? So we're going after a certain plant community. So knowing how to apply and prescribe fire in a certain way so that we get those plant communities is what we're after here. And consistently, what we see in those areas, those vegetation communities that are created and maintained by fire, is you take the let's just say the eastern subspecies average nest success is somewhere around 20%, and those early successional plant communities, many of which have been managed by fire, you can see nest success jump up to 40 to 50%. I feel like is the number that keeps coming up in a lot of these studies is we're almost doubling or even more than doubling nest success by having those vegetation communities that are conducive for turkey nesting. And just to kind of double down on that even further, Dr. Craig Harper and Dave Bueller just finished up a study at the University of Tennessee, and this that study was done in South Middle Tennessee. For those of y'all that listen to us on the Wild Turkey Science podcast, you've heard us say this so many times, but it was only like 7% of the landscape was in that plant type, that plant community type. Half of the hens that they had tagged in that study, and they had a lot of them, you know, it was into the hundreds, chose to nest there, and their nest success was 2 times greater than hens that nested elsewhere. So we're talking about a single digit percentage of the landscape that half of our hens are choosing to nest in, and that shows really strong selection. And then the demographic, the vital rate response is consistent with that, because we see that nest success rate go up as a result of that selection.
Yeah, I think that's an important point, that those vegetation types are really limited on the landscape. That shows up time and time again. We also have seen selection for those cover types that are really extreme like that. I remember one of the historical accounts from Dan Speak in Alabama showed that less than 1% of the landscape was in that high quality early succession that he would call high quality nesting cover. And he saw almost 40% of the nest were getting, they were selecting to put in that less than 1% of the landscape. And they were more successful on average than nests, in other cover types that are available. So this is, not something new. We've known there has been pretty intensive selection for those kinds of conditions. And when we go across the landscape and look for those types of cover on the landscape, they're fairly limited uh, across much of the wild turkey range.
I think just to interject there, there's a lot of good information. I think one of the things, and y'all touched on it a little bit. One of the things for me, as someone who, I'm a turkey enthusiast, I've done some prescribed burning, but I'm not nearly as knowledgeable as like guys like you are that do this every day and do this professionally. And one of the things that made me kind of like link together why there's such like sometimes there's a lot of like unanswered questions about prescribed fire. There's a lot of like, what is it for? Why is that good? Is there's such a disconnect because mostly we're so used to looking at a landscape that has not seen fire because so much of it is absent of it. I only learned a few weeks ago that the United States federal government was pretty much anti-fire in like the 1930s. They were like, that's destructive, to do it. And so,
Yeah, we had a really famous campaign around that with Smokey Bear.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so we gained this like general consensus that the landscape doesn't need fire. Fire is destructive. Fire is not natural. When actually it's like the absolute opposite of. And that was kind of like a big light bulb for me. It's like, that's why there's like this kind of all these like question marks around it, because we don't know. Like we've been voided of how necessary and how it's natural. Like it's natural landscape.
Absolutely. And one point that I do want to make really clear right now, because I'm seeing we're having a lot of listeners join in from all over the country, which is great. But a lot of what we're talking about right now is low intensity prescribed fire. And that is something that is very needed in a lot of the eastern forest of the United States, because throughout the eastern forest, we have relatively low or relatively long growing seasons, high annual precipitation, and what that all adds up to is plants grow fast, right? So the eastern half of the United States, you leave it alone and walk away, it wants to become a forest as quickly as it possibly can. And there's nothing wrong with that if that meets your objectives, but when it becomes a forest, which by definition has at least 80% canopy cover, there's not enough sunlight hitting the ground to grow those plants that turkeys hide in and turkeys feed on. And if we implement fire under a relatively closed canopy, you don't get very much vegetation response because the sunlight still isn't there. So I wanted to make that clear, and especially like as you get into more arid portions of the country, they don't require that frequent prescribed fire as much, because it's actually the limited rainfall that kind of maintains that successional stage. And like if you go down to South Texas, for example, in years that it rains, they have excellent reproductive habitat for turkeys. We see nest success go through the roof. We see brood survival go through the roof, and it's a banner year for them. But then in drought years, they get almost no reproductive success. And in fact, in dry years, in semi-arid and arid places, you'll see a lot of hens that don't even attempt to nest because they're probably not in the body condition to do so.
Yeah.
We have, unless we have a fair amount of questions rolling in, if y'all want to go ahead and
Yeah.
go to those.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. So the first one we got, I'm just going to try to work down. It says, for Dr. Lashley and Dr. Goolsby, thank you for the Wild Turkey Science podcast. A few years back, the period between burns was best 3 to 5 years. I personally like to do 3. But after listening to you, it may be better to even burn earlier than 3 years. Is there positives and negatives to each that make both valuable, or is there one way that is preferred?
That's a great question, and
Yeah.
I'll let Will tee off on this one because I know that he's chomping at the bit to do so. But I will say something that Will and I talk about fairly regularly is that both of us and several of our colleagues that have been studying fire and how it affects turkey productivity and how we would use fire to manage landscapes, our perception has been changing to be more frequent as well,
That's right.
where I now recommend a more frequent fire return interval than I would have 5 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And there's
Yeah.
reasons for that. We have new data coming to light, and as new data comes to light, we revise what our recommendations are from that. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, before I jump into frequency, I want to go ahead and immediately interject the caveat that the longer the growing season, the more precipitation and the higher soil fertility, the more often you're generally going to have to burn. As you know, soil fertility decreases, you can adjust that to be a little bit longer. So I just want to make that really clear that as we start throwing out these frequencies, you have to adjust them up and down based on how the plant community responds in your area. So the best way to approach choosing a fire frequency is to first go into it knowing the desired plant community that is going to be beneficial for whatever turkey related objective you're trying to achieve. If that's nesting cover, or if that's brooding cover, if that's something else. But generally speaking, throughout most of the Southeast, where the vast majority of prescribed fire is applied, what we see is if we burn on a 1-year rotation, the understory is very short with limited cover, and it's mostly comprised of grasses. Turkeys can use grasses for nesting cover, but they don't really get a whole lot out of it other than that. Then you go to a 2-year fire return interval, and you've got a pretty good mix of grasses and those forbs that Marcus alluded to earlier. So these are just herbaceous flowering plants. Most people just would consider them wildflowers. The important thing about forbs, well, there's several, is one, a lot of our forbs tend to be our best seed producers, and everybody knows that turkeys love to eat a seed. Two, they're also really attracted to insects, and everybody knows that poults, you know, they're gobbling up those insects, especially for those first couple of weeks of life. It's very important to have that high protein food source to them so they can put on their flight feathers as quickly as possible and start getting up off the ground and start getting away from predators. So we know the insect attraction is really important too. The final, contribution that forbs make to turkey habitat is that they tend to have an umbrella structure. So they have a single stem in the center, and then they have branches that go out from there. And what that adds up to is they still allow sunlight through, and they still allow open space between each individual plant so that poults can run around through them very easily. But they don't give up that overhead concealment cover in the process of doing so. So they don't expose themselves to predators while they're out feeding in those forbs. So we go to that 2-year fire return. We got a good mix of grass and forbs. And then if you look at, I mean, it's so obvious. If you look at some of these demonstration plots, I wish I could throw an image up right now of a few of them. But when you go from a 2-year fire return interval to a 3-year fire return interval, you are going to have trees that escape that fire and grow up into the mid-story. It's just gonna happen. So you end up forming a little bit of a mid-story. That means that you're going to have a little bit more shade in the stand. You're going to have fewer plants where that shade is. It's going to be moister in terms of the soil conditions. So it's going to grow plants, potentially grow plants more rapidly. Although the shade is going to limit that somewhat. It's not going to be as fire adapted over time as you increase that soil moisture. It's also going to have a lot of shrubby cover down at ground level. And that's great for a hen to nest in, right? But if you're after brooding cover, which time and again, and I'm sure we'll build off of this as we go on tonight, but time and again, what we're finding in most of our studies is, yes, we want to address nest success and we want to manage habitat to increase that, but it really seems like brooding cover is the number one thing that we find lacking on most of the properties that we visit because it's really hard to create and you have to be very intentional about doing it.
So I got another question that'll actually work off that one really well. The second thing is I'm trying to address, like, there's 347 people in there. And so y'all threw some terms out, like early succession, understory, mid-story, brooding cover. Like, can you just give me like kind of an overarching view of like what all that means in case somebody's hearing that? Like, I don't know what a mid-story is. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, I was trying to do that a little bit earlier, Lake. When I'm saying ground cover, that can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. But I'm thinking about plants that are shorter than my, chest height down. And when you're managing for turkeys, we are thinking about managing the amount of sunlight that's penetrating down to that layer of vegetation. And then we can use fire to adjust the composition and structure of the plant community in that layer, which is where turkeys are. I mean, obviously where they're living, right? When they're not in a tree, their whole world is right there in that ground layer. So when I say understory, I'm talking about that ground cover under that height. And we start to get up about shoulder height and then think about trees or shrubs, tall shrubs that are kind of getting over your head, but they're not capturing full sun. Like they're not a codominant or dominant tree. If you're in a forested situation, that collectively is the mid-story. So they're kind of in that middle ground where they're not the dominant species if you're in a forest, uh, but they're taller than you are generally. So they would be catching light before you get down to that ground layer that we're really paying attention to, is so important for turkey productivity.
Gotcha. So, like I said, the question that kind of pairs right off what you were just talking about, and one I'm sure y'all have heard a whole lot, is where do hens nest if you burn an area? Like if you run a fire through there, where are the hens supposed to nest?
You mean in the year? Are they asking in the year that you burn it?
Yes, yeah, and I think I mean,
Hmm.
extrapolating a little bit here, but I think
Hmm.
it's getting on towards like there's one of the most common worries. Like if you do a prescribed burn in April, they're like, "Oh my goodness, you're burning up
Yeah.
all the nest," you know.
Yeah. So that's where we
Yeah.
go. That's where we go, like from our stand level management to our property level or landscape level management is how we refer to it a lot of times. And
Mhm.
so when you burn a patch, especially if you burn a patch right before nesting season, you want to make sure that you have nesting cover in an adjacent patch, so that we never want to fully eliminate that nesting cover from the landscape. So that's where we start thinking about timing our fires so that we're not burning adjacent patches in the same years. And so we can specifically and intentionally manage some areas of the property that have better nesting cover. And then we want to also manage areas directly adjacent to that so that they have high quality brooding cover. Because if the hen hatches off that clutch successfully, she then has to travel with her poults to the area where they're going to bug. And the further they have to go to do that, the more likely that they're going to get killed in the process of doing so. So generally speaking, the way that I'll set it up is if you had two patches right next to each other and you're doing a 2-year burn rotation, the stand that um, the stand that was burned in the current year is going to provide your brooding cover that summer, and the stand that was burned in the previous year is going to provide your nesting cover that year. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah, because it ends up with so you end up with a property that doesn't have just one cover type. You know,
Exactly.
you end up like a patchwork of
Yeah.
different covers.
Yeah, and like Will was saying, you're trying to be deliberate about that so that you're maximizing the productivity of the turkey population. When she can nest in high quality cover that might have been burned last year or the year before, uh, and then she can immediately take poults right after they hatch, right across the fire break to a recent burn that's very high quality herbaceous cover. You're setting them up for success when you accomplish that. And I think that's an important part of this, is to think through how are you expecting them to use it, and be deliberate about how you set up your management plan so that you're accomplishing things like that make it really easy for them to be successful.
Yeah. And to build off of that is, and that's why I wanted to make the point at the start of this, that fire is just a tool to manage vegetation, right? Because if you apply it the wrong way and you manage the vegetation incorrectly, it can actually be detrimental to turkeys. So that's what we're trying to avoid, is keep the bird's biology in mind, so that we have the right species composition and structure of plants in a certain area. And if that is not going to meet its year-round needs, well, we know we have to provide for those other needs somewhere else on the property.
Mhm. Yeah, and I will say, like, I have taken plenty of questions, and I know that folks get bent out of shape about burning and whether or not that's happening at the time of nesting. And I completely understand that perspective, and particularly when you're operating at a really large scale, where you're burning really large patches, burning during nesting has a potential negative interaction, obviously. But even so, I've been in part of several studies, and the one during my PhD work was in lonely pine ecosystem. It was on public land. They were burning principally during that time frame at large scales. And I honestly, that changed the way that I was looking at that interaction, because even in that context, so few of the nests were being influenced by fire. It was pretty remarkable. They were burning large acreages of the upland during nesting, and it was still virtually none of the nests. It was less than 1% in 2 of the years were even exposed, and it's because of the conditions that turkeys were selecting to nest in.
Mm-hmm.
They were typically using areas that were not very flammable, and they were also structurally not in a condition where we were targeting them for fire. And one thing that I also noted in that same landscape is that because it was so productive, those same burns were also producing really high quality brooding cover, which was the problem on the landscape. So, when I'm working with people, I don't encourage people to target burning at that time, but I also think that, some of the negative perception that people have of that is unwarranted. Because we're talking, again, think about the history of this species. We're talking about an entire landscape that burned all the time during the growing season, and they still nest on the ground.
Mm-hmm.
If it was, completely detrimental, they probably wouldn't do that.
True.
So I know that's a potential sore subject for folks, so we may as well just get out in front of it and talk about it.
Yeah. And another thing about that too is a lot of people see prescribed burning applied at a large scale, because a lot of times what they're most familiar with, they're seeing, government agencies burn. And keep in mind that when they implement those burns, that turkey, maximizing turkey abundance is not their objective. Oftentimes they have ecosystem level management goals that they're after. So on a property that I set up where we're trying to maximize turkey abundance, rarely is a landowner going to implement a burn larger than 40 or 50 acres. And I've been on many properties where we have scaled it down as far as 10 to 20 acres per burn patch, because we want to make sure that we have all of those patches arranged in such a way that they're in close proximity to each other, and you don't end up with this huge, expanse of just black soot, right, where there's no plant growth. Because turkeys aren't going to go out in the middle of that. They'll pick around the edges and bug a little bit, but we tend to keep our burn scale small when the objective is to maximize turkeys on a property.
Yeah, and generally, private landowners have a greater opportunity to achieve that.
That's right.
As you scale down, there's more logistically required per acre being burned.
Yeah, it's a good point. Another question we got, I'm working down the list here and it's steadily growing. Is there a way to promote forb and grass growth after a burn? Overseeding, soil disturbance, etc.
Typically it is not required. There's a lot, basically, all of our native plants persist for a long time in the seed bank. So chances are you've already got those seeds of those beneficial grasses and forbs just waiting for the opportunity. And oftentimes what that opportunity looks like is they need sunlight. So if it's a forest, you got to open up that canopy. And then number two, a lot of times they need all the litter, the leaf litter out of the way, or the pine needles out of the way. If you're in the deep south where, we're so pine dominated. And one way you can do that is with prescribed fire. So once you have returned sunlight to the ground and you start burning, you burn off that litter layer, which is like mulch in your flower bed that keeps your weeds from growing, right? You'll get germination of a lot of those plants. And in addition to that, and Marcus has some really good data on this, as you start burning areas and they start developing that vegetation, you have animals like birds that bring in, and I'm not just talking about, turkey birds, I'm talking about, all sorts of different songbirds, and they bring in seeds from those various plants, and then they actually plant it for you. So in the vast majority of cases, it's really not needed to overseed after prescribed fire. And in fact, the only places where I've seen that really being necessary is I have seen a few landowners um, that take land out of agricultural production. This had a long history, sometimes of multiple herbicide applications a year, and that seed bank has been exhausted over time as a result of that. And so sometimes we need to give it a little jump start. But generally speaking, once it goes fallow for a few years, a lot of those plants start to colonize through the same process I just described.
Yeah, definitely. I see, just to add a little bit to that, when it spoils, the substrate is coming from mining or something like that, where
Yeah,
you have kind of a really disturbed soil bank and seed bank. I have seen situations where, planting an array of forbs might be necessary to get the forb diversity that you're looking for. But most of the time, I'm right with Will, you will be very surprised with what's hiding in there. And like Will was saying, what is riding in the bird community in particular. I see plant species get directed into burned areas and they start colonizing when we never saw the plants before,
yeah.
uh, apparently coming from the bird community.
Yeah. And one exception to that I'll throw out real quickly, Lake, is there is a possibility that if you have high coverage of certain exotic invasive plants on the site, they may prevent those beneficial plants, those native plants from growing in. So you have to deal with that first, in that situation. And oftentimes that requires an herbicide.
That's worth mentioning because I mean, I've seen that personally down here with friends on different properties with Bermuda grass, Bahia grass, Kogan grass, just some,
Yep.
stuff that's
And
just
then you get into fescue and smooth brome the further you go north. All those pasture grasses tend to form a blanket and they do not allow a lot of those beneficial forbs to grow up in an area. So those exotic pasture grasses are a huge barrier to the growth of good brooding habitat for turkeys.
again,
But when you do take the steps to remove those species, it is pretty remarkable. I get surprised every time I see it. The plant community response, even though it may have been in some sort of sod forming grass for a long time, the response is also, often pretty remarkable.
um, going back to, what I was talking about at the beginning of this thing about just this disconnect with fire being natural. I still, one of the big like things for me is I didn't know how much grass we have on our landscape that was exotic. If
Yeah,
you really get to digging into that, it'll blow your mind. Like you see a pasture, you just assume like you don't even think like, oh, that's exotic grass, but a lot of the times it is.
Mm,
yeah.
virtually always.
Yeah, virtually always. Good point. Next question. Our land was logged 9 years ago, almost clear cut, currently thick with aspen regen and grasses and ferns. Is this scenario worth burning?
Did you say aspen?
Says aspen, yeah, aspen regen.
Okay.
Not exactly sure where this gentleman's writing from, but aspen regen, grasses.
Probably out west.
Yeah, I would assume so with the aspens, but I'm not sure.
I'd be hesitant to encourage you to burn in that situation, but to be completely frank about it, I don't have that much experience, particularly in that system, in that condition.
Yeah. Yeah, I would say the same. It's a very different situation out there. And if you've got aspen growing, probably a much shorter growing season, that's going to influence the plant community as well. So I'd have to punt on that one too.
Gotcha. Next question. What is the return interval for a turkey after a low intensity fire? So basically, like if you run a low intensity fire through a place, like how quickly are turkeys going to return to that? How quickly do they come back to that sort of thing?
I can jump in here because I don't
I
know
knew
if
you would
Will
love
has,
this one.
I feel
I
like
know
I could.
Will
I feel like
probably
I
has
could.
some similar types of data, but I have done a fair amount of work on this particular thing because it's just intriguing to me. And we have had a number of burned areas that we're studying. And one of the things I wanted to see is how fast are species colonizing. And we will literally be putting cameras out when you could still see the fire moving through the stand. We basically take it up, run the fire through, and put cameras back in. And we commonly have turkeys in it the day the fire happened. And I would say extraordinarily common the next day.
Yeah.
It's it has this magnet effect on turkeys, and that's one thing that I think is undervalued about prescribed fire from a hunting standpoint is a recently burned area that's been burned in the same year as the turkey season is an extraordinarily attractive area, especially for a strutter with some hens. And it's a great
Absolutely.
place to target when you're hunting because of that.
I mean, I've
There's
had, I've
a
had,
lot of funny comments popping up about that on the right.
Yeah.
I
In
mean,
You ever
Florida,
heard it
lots of
called the
birds
soot
get
bird?
shot when the smoke is still smoldering down here. The true firebird.
I
Yeah.
can't tell you how many times I've seen it. Jordan Blissett took one of my favorite pictures. It was last spring, but we killed a turkey, and like as we were walking out, I mean the fire was still. I mean there was still smoke
Mhm.
up, and I mean
Mm-hmm.
there were turkeys everywhere. So
Yeah.
yeah, another common misconception thing. I remember I heard it years ago. They're like, "Yeah, we'll burn that." They're like, "Well, it won't be good again until a couple years from now, but it needs it." And I was like, "What? What are you talking about?"
Yeah.
Yeah. It's going to
Yeah.
be attractive right away.
And a lot of that is about easy access to food, right? I mean,
Yeah.
like all those seeds and all those insects and snails and everything else that
Yeah.
are
I'm seeing,
killed and exposed right after fire. It's just a buffet.
yeah, I'm
Yeah.
seeing lots of comments pop up, and I have said this in the past. It's really easy to catch a dead grasshopper, and bugs like that are just laying around everywhere in there. I also have an interesting anecdote. Um, it was in northern Mississippi that I had some treatments being put in on an area, and it had not been burned on that landscape. I knew for decades because the landowner had lived on the property since he was a kid, and he was in his 80s at the time, and there had been no burning. And I remember setting one of those units, which was only a couple acres, on fire and coming back that evening just to check it. And a turkey had decided it needed to roost in the smoke in that burned area. And we just joked that it must have seen the smoke and it had no reason to know what that was, but it still was attractive and it compelled that gobbler to come roost right there in the smoke.
So this next question I can essentially skip over because the gentleman was asking about a property that he acquired, and he's like, "Would fire help attract turkeys to it?" So I think we just
Yes.
answered that The next one. Let's see, are you looking specifically at fire obligate habitats like longleaf pine forest and or other types of habitats that suffered from the suppression efforts throughout the last century?
Yeah, so we do a lot of work in pine systems. Loblolly pine, longleaf pine are the two main ones, obviously. But Marcus and I both have done a good bit of burning in eastern hardwood forest as well. And the way that you approach it is a little bit different. And I don't know, I almost say you have some luxuries in pine systems that you don't have in hardwood systems. And you can get away with more. You can burn on more days in pine systems, but overall, the concept is still the same. We
Mhm.
definitely want to dial back our intensity when we're burning in hardwood forest, but the leaf litter helps us do that a little bit because it's not quite as flammable. It's not, it doesn't burn quite as hot. But after we dial back that intensity, we probably also want to go a little bit longer between burns, because typically, even if you've opened the canopy somewhat in hardwoods, they've got, a much larger leaf area index, so they create more shade. So you've got more moisture in the stand. You may not grow the plant community back quite as quickly as you would in an upland pine system, so you can go a little bit longer between burns. But other than that, the benefits of burning in those areas is just the same as it is in pine stands. All we're trying to
Yeah.
do here is, and there was a listener that put in a question just a little while ago, and he said he had noticed that he put in some little small patch clear cuts on his property in New York, and where that vegetation grew up, he noticed hens nesting there. Absolutely, all we're trying to do is keep that vegetation that they're nesting in at that right height so that they continue to nest in it, and then we use fire to knock that back in a cheap way, and instead of just walking away from it and allowing it to grow back up into a forest slowly over time. And that's all the fire is doing, is keeping it
Mhm.
at that height that turkeys like.
Yeah.
Um, so while
And
y'all touched on, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead. Go ahead. While you're
well, I was just going to add, regarding the hardwoods, they're catching more sunlight, so it's easier in that system for sunlight to be limited. So that's something to note. Also, when we're talking about burning in hardwoods, we're talking about an upland hardwood species, and a lot of that savanna that we were describing historically was oak savanna. A lot of those upland oak species and chestnut also uh, are fire adapted species. They have traits that promote fire in the system. And there have been some really good studies trying to address what you're going to lose in terms of timber volume. And it's been very low. It's usually below 3% loss over many fires for over a couple of decade period. And in many cases, it's less than 1% that you would lose in timber value in those oak forest systems, even though they're being burned multiple times.
Hmm.
Again, to reiterate something that Will said earlier, we're thinking about low intensity surface fires. And if you're implementing those and also taking care to make sure that you don't have a lot of down woody debris around trees that could catch on fire, you can generally burn those safely and do it repeatedly and still not really give up timber value.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of my hardwood burns, we're talking about flame heights less than a foot. Sometimes we just got 6, 8 inch flames creeping through there is all. Um, and to build one more thing off that real quickly, if you're in a more northern state like New York, you, just like I was talking about earlier with the soil fertility relationship, you've got a much shorter growing season. So you can probably start getting out to, 3 to 5 years, depending on how the vegetation responds between fires.
Yeah,
um,
I think that's the critical thing is for you to take the time to learn what high quality nesting cover and high quality brooding cover look like and be responsive to the vegetation that you're seeing and use fire at the frequency that you need to accomplish that structure.
Yeah. Marcus, don't you have some videos showing that on your socials that people
Oh
could
yeah.
look up if they wanted to see that?
Yeah, just comparing different fire frequencies.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have a ton of stuff. It's mostly in the South where things grow really fast, but it's a great visual for folks to see that. One thing, like, I know you're trying to get to another question, but that's been something that's pretty, I would say, pretty frustrating to me when I go and work with private landowners. I often want to show them what high quality brood cover looks like, and they don't have any. So it's incredibly difficult to do that. I mean, Will and I are actively trying to educate people in various formats. I know some folks mentioned the podcast. We have a training academy that we're doing that's intensive in a couple of weeks if folks are interested in that. We're trying to show people through videos or these trainings or whatever what these things look like, and it's pretty frustrating when you're trying to show them something like brooding cover that's so important for turkey productivity, and you literally can't find any to show it to them.
It would be frustrating. One thing someone asked about tips about specifically burning in hardwoods, which I've been on for a while, but they also asked like particularly weather conditions for doing burns during the dormant season.
Mm-hmm. In hardwood systems.
Yeah. Like I said, I saw the question specifically was hardwood burning tips for burning in hardwoods, and then which y'all been talking about. But then they said particularly weather conditions to look for burning during the dormant season in upland hardwoods.
Yeah, I'll let Marcus take that. You probably burned more in hardwoods than I have.
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. I think I want to first say again, when we're talking about burning, we're typically thinking about doing this in upland hardwood system where, in the eastern US, it might be white oaks and, northern red oak and some of those upland oaks that are dominating those stands. And particularly if those forests are relatively close canopy, we're kind of taking a part of the burn window away. So during the, if you're trying to burn during growing season months and you have a relatively closed canopy hardwood system, it'll be really hard to find conditions that you can burn in. That being said, a lot of the burning is occurring during the fall and winter, and in some cases early spring. And just after leaf cast is a great time to do that. I'm typically thinking about using the lowest intensity firing techniques that I can. So I'm more reliant generally on backing fire. Often if you have terrain involved, that's a consideration. And, you running a head fire up a hill can get more intense. So I'm typically thinking of the relative humidity being a little bit lower often in those systems than I would be thinking about in pine systems. So burning and, down in the lower 30s is not that unreasonable. 5 to 10 mile an hour wind speeds is pretty stable wind that you can get a stable fire, especially if you have a lot of terrain. So I'm thinking about, trying to pick conditions more in that realm. Also, the cloud cover in that system, especially when you have a lot of shade cast from some of those hardwoods, can be pretty important. And you'll see on an overcast day, it'll really suppress the fire activity, and you'll get more of a meandering, low intensity fire. Whereas if, on the same day, the cloud cover separates, you might see that intensity pick up. So those are some of the things. I would take a moment to say, depending on where you're burning and what the substrate is and the forest composition and some of those other things, some of the fire weather conditions that we'd be looking for start to change. And I think it's important for folks to realize that you have local training opportunities from your state forestry agency. You should
Yes.
definitely take advantage of that, and you'll start to get a really good handle more locally in your situation with your conditions that you're burning in. You'll get more specific parameters, from a lot of that training and that experience in your system. I want to say that because it can vary quite a bit depending on what system you're in and where you're at and what you're trying to accomplish.
Yeah, and we would be really remiss if we didn't just throw out there briefly that most states have prescribed burn manager training that is available,
Yeah.
and in many cases that does limit your liability. By having that training, this is another step in limiting your liability, just like having a burn plan, just like making sure you're following all the laws in your area by getting a burn permit before you burn. And how that looks is too complicated to address because it varies so much from state to state, but I just wanted to throw that out there.
Yeah, and I think that's an important thing that's really scary, right, about fire. I mean, we should have a healthy, uh, not necessarily fear, but we should realize that, we're using a tool that is inherently has some danger associated with it. But many states, particularly in the South, have right to burn laws. We have these trainings available, and folks taking those prudent actions is helping to guard you against those liability issues. That being said, I saw some people from various parts of the United States. That's something that can vary substantially depending on which state you're in. And in many states, there are no right to burn laws.
Right.
And you may have a much harder time getting burn permits or finding help or training in some of those scenarios, and you may, in some cases, even need to consider alternative disturbance methods that can serve a similar purpose to
Yeah.
prescribed fire.
I'm glad y'all touched on all that because we're running short on time, so there's no way we're going to get to all these questions. But a lot of them are resources, like are there classes, burn permits. So glad y'all touched
Yes.
that because a
Yeah.
lot of folks are asking.
Well, yeah, that's important, especially for something like this. Like there's a learning curve here, and there are trainings available. You're from your state agency. We commonly in the South have learn and burn opportunities where you can go get experience with other people. There
Yep.
are prescribed burn associations popping up all over the place.
Yep.
I actually have a free online training that people could engage in and learn about a lot of this stuff. And one of the things that we put in that training is connecting you, or at least teaching you how to connect with your local prescribed burn associations, because that's essentially landowners coming together to share knowledge and resources to help each other get burning done. And I think they've been pretty successful, and we're seeing them pop up all over the South and Midwest in particular. So those are all great opportunities for folks. I certainly don't recommend that people just go out and strike a match and throw it out. Take the opportunity to get these trainings and get yourself knowledgeable and get experience with others that are knowledgeable before you start trying to tackle this on your own.
Yeah, the other thing is it's like when you hear that topic come up, I told somebody one time, it's like, man, it's really not that different from like, prescribed fire is essential to a landscape, right? A shotgun is essential to turkey hunting, but I'm not just going to hand somebody that's never touched a gun before a shotgun. They're going to have to go through, they need to learn firearm safety. They get comfortable with it. Similar line of thinking. You know what I mean?
Yep.
It's just, but those resources are out there, like y'all were just saying.
Yeah. I think, folks are doing it now. They're realizing hopefully that there are some real things to gain from understanding how you can use fire to manage for turkeys or other species. And, there are resources available to you to get knowledgeable about it so that, that you feel more comfortable using that tool.
Mhm. Oh, here's a fun one. How many other animal species will a burn benefit?
473.
That's pretty close.
A
Okay,
lot.
next question. No.
A lot. Basically, man, how to say this as succinctly as possible. Pretty much any species that uses an herbaceous understory for all or part of its life history, or a shrubby understory for part of all or part of its life history, benefits from burning. And generally speaking, the the birds, the reptiles, the amphibians, the mammals, go on down the list, that we're seeing in the greatest decline right now are the ones that are dependent on those plant communities that are maintained by prescribed fire.
Yeah, I can say it a different way just to reiterate what Will's saying. If it's a species that thrives in a grassland or prairie, or an open forest condition with an absent midstory, it's going to benefit from fire generally, which is a lot of species.
Yeah. I like I said, the best thing that someone could do is, if you get the opportunity, I mean, like videos, I mean, you can probably see it on videos, but if you get the opportunity to set foot, like physically set foot on a place that has been, through a prescribed fire rotation, that's what will really make the light bulb go off.
Yeah.
Just how crazy of a difference it makes. It's almost like you can't comprehend how biodiverse a place can be until you see a place that's been managed with fire. It's insane.
Mhm. Yeah,
Absolutely.
when that's done really well, it's some of the most aesthetically pleasing, to view, and it's sort of infectious, the diversity of species that you're calling, including turkey gobbling.
Yeah. For the next question, we are running out of time. I know we're about to post there's a t-shirt giveaway at the end of this. The link's gonna be posted to that soon. So if you want to get in on that t-shirt giveaway, watch for that link. We've got time for a little bit more. Will burning knock back sedges so that Forbes can come back? Will a fire knock back sedges so it can promote Forbes? That's,
You want me to take this one, Will? I see
Sure.
you smiling. Well, so I guess where I would take this is to the timing of fire. So we just had a podcast episode on this with one of our colleagues that does a lot of fire work, and he just got some really great information out on the timing of fire. So we were talking about earlier burning during the dormant season. Well, the reality is we have far more burn days throughout the year than that. And to answer this question, if you're burning really frequently only during the dormant season, you tend to benefit grasses and graminoids like sedges. So you tend to promote those perennial grasses and sedges. If you start to change the timing of the year, like particularly moving it around to late growing season or fall, you start to shift the benefit toward forbs. So in some cases, I have recommended that with landowners, and I've seen them implement this really well, where they changed or diversify, we should say, the timing that they're using fire, and they start to see a shift in dominance in plants to favor forbs. So if you're in a situation where it's grass or sedge or other graminoid dominance, that may be a way that you can help steer that plant community to a more desirable composition, is by changing, the timing of the fire within the year.
um, unfortunately, we are at time. I mean, there was just no way we could get through all those questions. In one way, that's awesome. Like I love
I
it
think we got four, didn't we?
We'll
But
have to do it again.
I want to give you all the opportunity to make sure that these folks know, like, where where can they find y'all? Where can they find your podcast? Like I said, both of y'all put out some excellent resources about prescribed fire and about a whole variety of other things. So where can folks find y'all?
Go ahead, Will.
Wild Turkey Science Podcast is the best place, and we have a huge well, I don't know, I shouldn't say huge because our library is not that big compared to some other podcasts, but we've got over 100 episodes on there, many of them touching on fire and different aspects of fire. So if you want to continue your education, especially if you want to get into some of the more advanced topics, go look up those episodes. And then I'm pretty active on Instagram. It's at Dr. Will Goolsby, and that's Dr.Will_Goolsby, Gulsby. And if you want to hit me up with an email too, you can find us pretty easily if you just search our names. And I'm at Auburn University, and Marcus is at University of Florida.
Yeah, and my alias online is at Dr. Disturbance, so you can pretty much find me on any platform under that. I have run the UF Game Lab as well, and we have a YouTube channel and a lot of these different topics. We try to show visuals, and the podcasts are there. Also, we have online training available for this fire. Dr. Goolsby and I also are actively trying to put together seminars. We have one coming up in a couple of weeks in Alabama. So if folks are interested in that, make sure to check that out. But we're, like you said, trying to provide information through various platforms, and feel free to reach out if you have questions or want to be linked to particular resources. Happy to help.
I just
Yeah,
want to
and
know, Will, when are you going to get an Instagram handle as good as Lashley's? Because his sounds like a villain in a comic book.
I don't know, man. Can you help me make one up? I'm not
Yeah,
creative enough to come up with something like that.
we can work on it.
Well, I figured no one would remember my name, but they might remember that handle. So.
Oh, no, guys, I appreciate the time. There's a lot of activity in the chat talking about how much they enjoyed the information. So, yeah, guys, like I said, final thoughts. Everything in here like this recording will be posted to the onX website. So if there's something you missed, do not fret. Also, look up with these guys. Like I said, constantly they're putting out resources. Listen to their podcast. It's really good stuff. Guys, thank you for your time, and thank everyone for watching.
Yeah, thanks. I enjoyed it, Lake.
Yeah, thanks, Lake.